recording, then officially present her, introduce her, and then give her the floor. And you know the system, or for those who join us today, there will be Professor Norton's talk for 50, 60 minutes, depend, and then a relatively long question-answer time. So let's say we will go all the way to 6:30 Toronto time. Then we say bye to our guests, and we have a little break, and the students will go back to the class. Okay, so let me introduce Professor Bonny Norton. Professor Bonny Norton is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a University Killian professor and distinguished university scholar in the Department of Language and Literacy Education at the University of British Columbia. Her primary research interests are identity and language learning, critical literacy, and international development. She's committed to the use of open technology for educational change and was awarded BC 2020 Academic of the Year for her leadership of the Global Storybooks project, and of which we will hear today. And she has also a website from which you can access all these fantastic tools that she and her co-researchers and collaborators have contributed. So please join me in welcoming Professor Norton to our research colloquium of today. Thank you. And the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Enrica. What a pleasure it is to be here. I'm going to, I think, before I even begin, I think just share screen. I think that's probably the best way to begin. And then I can, I see a few familiar faces, so it's really wonderful to see you all here. I'm addressing you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And like many of you, I am a guest on this land, on Indigenous land, and feel honored to be here and to be speaking from what is now called Vancouver, Canada. The title, I'm going to see if I can move the pictures over. The title of my talk is Identity, Investment, and Digital Storytelling for a Multilingual Future. I have to move this up so that I can actually, there we go, get to my first slide. So first of all, thank you to Dr. Enrica Picardo from CERL, Center for Educational Research in Languages and Literacies. I have been to OISD, of course, before, and for those of you, some of you may know, I actually did my PhD at OISD almost 30 years ago. And I do want to take the opportunity to thank my OISD PhD committee. I know not everyone is still around, but to acknowledge Roger Simon, Monica Heller, Jim Cummins, and Barbara Burnaby for helping to lay the
What's happening?
Experience at OISD, and feel very privileged to have had access to amazing scholars and, of course, a wonderful city. I'm also welcoming, I have some students, I'm currently teaching an online course at UBC called Language, Discourse, and Identity, and some of those students may be with us today. So the way I'm going to structure my presentation is to first offer an overview of the foundational work that I've done on identity, investment, and imagined communities. And I'm going to just put that up there. And this goes right back to research published in 1995 and my book in 2013. Where's my camera over here? And papers that I've actually done with one of my PhD students, for example, Ron Darwin in 2015, 2021. So some of those foundational ideas that I developed, in fact, initially here at OISD. And then I want to show the kind of connection to the development and research that I'm currently doing on the African Storybook, the Global Storybooks, and Storybooks Canada. But what I'm doing is taking the opportunity, since I know I'm working with doctoral students and MA students, to set my work in dialogue with discussions and research on new materialism, what is also called post-humanism, and also decolonial perspectives that I think people are very interested in. So in a sense, I'm looking at obviously issues of identity, investment, and imagined communities, but I'm also drawing on the lens of new materialism and decolonialism. So if we think about the questions that we ask in our research, and certainly when I started at OISE, I was very interested in issues of motivation. Are students motivated to learn? Are teachers motivated to teach? And I shifted to include a construct that I developed called investment, and we're going to learn a bit more about that today. And I ask, are students and teachers invested in the language and literacy practices of a given classroom and community? And then through the socio-material lens, to what extent is the socio-material implicated in the construction of identity and investment? And finally, are the African Storybook and Global Storybooks decolonial projects? So just touching on some of those conversations. So I'm going to take you, first of all, to a letter that Margaret Earley and I received a number of years ago, when a student of ours, Doris Abiria from Uganda, returned to Uganda with her two boys and her partner, who is Sam Ndema, who in fact had done a PhD with me at OISE. And this letter provides, I think, a very interesting window on language as a system and a social practice. So we asked Doris how the boys were doing. She had two young boys, and she said, the boys are getting better. In school, the teachers complain that they have gone with a style they are calling Western. The teachers say the boys have an accent that they do not hear, while the boys say the teachers speak English upside down. Paul talks to the teacher in class anytime he wishes, when children are expected first to listen to the teacher and talk when the teacher asks them. Now we keep checking on them frequently in school and supporting them more at home. We hope that by next year, they will be okay. So what was very compelling in this letter is the fact that what it means to be a good student in Canada is different from what it means to be a good student in Uganda. So in Canada, you ask questions, you talk to the teacher, you speak, you put up your hand, you're assertive. In Uganda, you wait to be asked. And of course, in Canada, we speak English, Canadian English, whereas in Uganda, they speak Ugandan English. So what we see here is that as people shift across time and space, what it means to be a good language learner is different in one place as opposed to another place. And we see that this also has to do with the way they are positioned in their classes and also their hopes for the future. Because Doris says, we keep checking on them frequently in school and supporting them at home. We hope that by next year, they will be okay. So a very interesting window on language as a system, but also a social practice in which issues of identity, imagined identities, human possibility, are negotiated. And that's why I argued, even my earlier work, every time language learners speak, they are not only exchanging information with their interlocutors, they are organizing and reorganizing a sense of who they are and how they relate to the social world. They are, in other words, engaged in identity construction and negotiation. So in terms of a definition of identity, I argue that identity is how a person understands his or her relationship to the world, how that relationship is structured across time and space, and how the person understands possibilities for the future. So what we see here is that as Paul moves from Canada to Uganda, he is renegotiating his identity across time and space. And also, this has implications for possibilities for the future. Will he be considered a successful student, or will he be considered a troublemaker? This in turn has implications for students' imagined communities and imagined identities. I've argued that a learner's imagined identity and hopes for the future will affect her or his investment in the language and literacy practices of a given classroom and subsequent progress in language learning. So what do I mean by investment? I've argued that if learners invest in a second language, they will acquire a wider range of symbolic and material resources, which will increase their cultural capital and social power. And by symbolic capital, I refer to language, education, friendship, and material capital, material resources as capital, real estate, and money. What I've done is to draw a distinction between motivation and investment. Motivation is a predominantly psychological construct, focusing on the individual as unitary and coherent, in which the character trait of the learner is identified. And very often, people who are interested in motivation are interested in measurement. How do we measure motivation? Whereas investment is a sociological construct. It looks at the learner as a social being, as having a complex identity, changing across time and space, and reproduced in social interaction. For me, investment is about the centrality of power and how we have to navigate relations of power at micro and macro levels. In the paper that I recommended that you read for class today is one of my more recent papers published last year with Ron Darwin, who was a former student of mine, which asked the question, investment and motivation, what's the difference? We argue that learners, by virtue of their race, ethnicity, gender, social class, sexual orientation, and other inscriptions of identity, experience the world in unequal ways. Aligned with the goals of critical applied linguistics, investment is a tool that enables us to probe these inequalities and to challenge the dominant ideologies that perpetuate these inequalities. Herein lies perhaps the main distinction between investment and motivation. In an earlier paper published in 2015, Ron and I developed a more comprehensive model of investment, of the relationship between identity and investment, by incorporating more meaningfully issues of capital and ideology. But we did so because of shifts in the digital era. How do learners claim the right to speak, given the way power operates materially and symbolically in the digital era? So what we see is this very interesting connection between capital, and we draw particularly on the work of Bourdieu, where we're looking at economic capital, funds that you have, social capital, the networks that you have, your cultural capital, what you know, and connected to issues of ideology, which suggests the ways in which symbolic capital frame our possibilities in life. So the challenges for the 21st century are that we live in a new social world. There are new forms of social interaction. There are new ways of conceptualizing speech. So how do we claim the right to speak in the digital era? This connects to issues of the socio-material. And I refer here to the work of Diane Dagenet, who was a colleague actually at Simon Fraser University here in British Columbia. She says a growing number of researchers is exploring how theories of the socio-material might help expand the discussion on identity by considering how the social is related to the material. And here we look at the work of Suresh Kanagaraja. Alistair Pennycook was also, in fact, a PhD student at OISE in the same cohort, in fact, as I was. Colleen Toohey, who's at Simon Fraser University, and somebody with whom I've worked a great deal with. So scholarship in this area looks closely at processes of becoming as humans and materials merge in particular environments and affect learning. So in other words, the material world, the digital world, is not simply a backdrop to the social context in which we live. It actually has a fundamental relationship between people and things, and how identity is implicated in this way. I've been doing research in African communities, in fact, way before 2013, but more particularly from 2003 to the present, when I was in a position to look at the possibilities of the digital and ways in which the digital could be harnessed for educational and social change. And I just wanted to show you, I worked particularly in a Ugandan community where there was no electricity and running water. But you'll see in this little image here in the school library, there was solar power. So people harnessed solar power to run their computers and their cell phones. I worked with an amazing group of MA and PhD students at UBC, as well as my colleagues Maureen Kendrick and Margaret Early. And here we see, for example, Doris Sibiria, who came and did her MA, Sam Andema, Julia Tembe, Harriet Matanya, and many others, who some of whom live in Canada, some of whom are working in the African context. And this particular photo was taken by a colleague called Willie Ngaka, and it serves as a metaphor for the relationship between imagined identities and the promise of the digital. It's an image of a keyboard that was developed in northwestern Uganda, where there was no electricity and running water. But people said, we are going to build keyboards and teach ourselves how to type, so that when we actually have access to the digital, we will already have the skills to harness the power of the digital. So I think it's an amazingly creative way of planning for imagined identities in the future. If we look, for example, at Henrietta, and this is a paper published with Shelley Jones and Dana Himbasibwe. Henrietta was a young woman living in rural Uganda, who did many domestic chores in her home and in her community. But when you put a computer or a video camera in her hand, you shifted her identity in relationship to others in her community. And she could actually go and enter into a police commissioner's office and take photos of him, because she was considered to be a person with power. Either she had power or she knew people who had power. And as a result of those material resources, she experienced shifts of identity. And here you see these young women in an internet cafe, where they had never been inside an internet cafe in Uganda, but after they developed digital literacy skills, they went in and said, today is our day. This is true, of course, not only for students, but also for teachers. So Betty, a Ugandan teacher, made the point, I feel very powerful like a man because I had never held a camera in my life. I've always seen only men carrying cameras and taking photos in big public functions, like maybe independence celebrations, political rallies, and wedding ceremonies. But now, as I move in the community taking pictures with my camera, I feel I'm also very powerful like a man. I'm now a learned person. And this was data taken by Sam Ndema during the course of his PhD research. And I find this data a little bittersweet because Betty was already a learned person well before she picked up a camera. Because she was a successful teacher, she ran a home, she had a family, she did very well in her community, but it was only when she carried a camera that she felt powerful, like a man, and possibly even more significantly, she felt, I am now a learned person. So the question becomes, how do we harness the power of open technology to promote investment in multilingualism, given the importance of the digital in providing opportunities for an expanded range of identities for teachers and for students? How can we harness open technology for learners and teachers of diverse languages? And this got me involved in a project called the African Storybook, which is based, actually, was developed by a group called Sadie in South Africa, and then was actually repurposed by a team that I lead at UBC in the form of Storybooks Canada, Global Storybooks, and Indigenous Storybooks. So here we see here a picture of Tessa Welch, who was the project director of the African Storybook. And we are at the moment at the launch of the African Storybook in 2013 in Stellenbosch, South Africa. And you can just pick up your cell phones, or perhaps after the talk, and check out africanstorybook.org to find out more about this particular project. It provides open access to picture storybooks in the languages of Africa for children's literacy, enjoyment, and imagination. There are over 200 African languages, as well as English, French, and Portuguese. There are, in fact, now over 2,000 storybooks and, in fact, over 7,000 translations. So it's a remarkable resource for parts of African communities which don't have access to papers, to books, to storybooks, but they may have one cell phone that they can utilize in their classrooms and project on a sheet on a classroom wall. So I work with an amazing team here at UBC. I think Monica Shank-Lau actually was a master's student at OIZ.
She was my student, yeah.
Oh my goodness, well, there you go. This is how the world keeps turning, right? And she's now doing her PhD with me and others. And so we have Sarah Davison, the Indigenous scholar, who's now at Simon Fraser University and is project lead of Indigenous Storybooks. Asma Afreen, who's doing a PhD with me. We have Ingrid Schechter, community outreach. Liam Doherty just finished his PhD with Patsy Duff. And part of the team is Espen Strange Johansen, who is now in Norway, and Michelle Gilman. So I've worked with this remarkable team, at UBC to repurpose 40 stories from the African Storybook to be utilized not only now in Canada, but in fact in over 50 countries in different parts of the world. So Storybooks Canada is a free open educational resource that promotes literacy and language learning in homes, schools, and communities. It makes 40 stories from the African Storybook available with text and audio in English, French, and the most widely spoken immigrant and refugee languages of Canada. We are also developing Indigenous storybooks and the Global Storybooks Literacy Portal. So here we have the image of Indigenous storybooks, and I hope if I have time to be able to demonstrate these sites to you, if only briefly. Here we have the Global Storybooks Portal that now, as I say, has over 50 sites where children can read, download, toggle, and listen to a wide variety of illustrated stories from the African Storybook and other open sites. So what is for us so exciting about this particular project is that it democratizes flows of information between the global South and the global North. So often information runs from the global North to the global South. But in this particular project, what we see is that an innovation from the global South is having a global impact beyond not only in Southern Africa, in the broader African context, but certainly throughout the world. And this is a very, very exciting development, which brings us to looking at decolonialism. And I'm drawing here from the book by Alistair Pennycook and Cynthia Makoni, who are making the case that we are trying to make a case for the bigger picture here, one where decolonizing applied linguistics is not just an issue of critical educational projects, but a much wider set of concerns about knowledge and research. Whose knowledge counts? What research do we do? What research is considered valuable and important? Who controls the access to that research? And if you think about the notion of capital that the model of investment deals with, what is one's social capital? Who has access to the networks of power in any given community? What cultural capital does one bring to a particular project, and what capital is valued in any particular context? If we look at how we theorize decoloniality, and this is a book that's just been published, 2022. I, in fact, endorsed this particular book. And Pinky McQuay makes the point that the nexus of decoloniality and ideology enables us to problematize the privileging of European knowledge, language, subjectivity, and the invisibilization of non-European forms of knowing. So what decolonial ideas and decolonial perspectives are challenging whose knowledge counts, and are making the case that we need to take more seriously languages and knowledge that are not necessarily based and located in European contexts. So this Global Storybooks project is, I gave a talk, in fact, for Cynthia Makoni's Global Virtual Forum, which he runs from Penn State, on the African Storybook, and said, would he consider this a decolonial project? And to which he replied, there are many synergies between decolonialism and the African Storybook and Global Storybooks. So it does ask the question, how can school teachers use global storybooks to promote multilingual literacy in classes where many languages are spoken? To what extent do the parallel texts in global storybooks promote language learning? Is translanguaging productive for language learning? To what extent can global storybooks promote multilingual language awareness? How can global stories promote multilingual identity? How well do stories travel from one region of the world to another? What are diverse readers' investments? How can we use global storybooks to promote homeschool connections for immigrant and refugee students? What challenges do translators face, and how is identity negotiated? So I wanted to give you just a snapshot of some of the research that our research team is doing here at UBC. And I'll begin with a research that Espen Spranger Johansson and I were doing in the Ugandan context. And this has been published in the Modern Language Journal in 2017. The question we ask is, what is Monica's investment in the African Storybook? How does this investment provide insight into her language teacher identity? So if you look, for example, at one of the stories called Andiswe Soccer Star, this is a story about a young girl who wants to play soccer, but is not permitted to because it's considered a boys' game, until one boy gets sick and she plays for the team and scores a goal. And the teacher says, yes, it really helped me. The African Storybook really helped me. It changed the attitude of boys, where they could think that a girl is not supposed to play football. But this time, when I go for my physical education lesson, when I prepare a lesson about football, they don't now complain. They don't kick the ball away from the girls. They just play together like that. This time they have started attitude change instead. It helped me a lot. So very interesting to see that her identity as a change agent in her school was important, because as, of course, the children's attitudes changed, so did her relationship to her class and the relationship that they had towards her. I've also been doing a research with Rahat Zaidi, Robin Metcalf, and I for French immersion in the Canadian context. And this article is just about to be published in the Canadian Journal of Applied Linguistics. And what we see is some kind of connection between the investments that students have in stories in the Ugandan context and those that we see here in the Canadian context. So the teacher says, I forget the name Punishment, the one where the boy eats all the fruit and then he's sick thereafter. There was an interesting conversation and the kids were engaged in the story. And I asked, that's really wonderful. How did you follow up after that? With any activities? I was just wondering. The teacher said, no, we did not follow up. We closed the conversation, we talked about it, and then sometimes something happens in class, like one student stood up on a table, and it's like, what kind of consequences could that have? And it kind of related back to that story. So very interesting, when children read stories, they do see that the story potentially has a certain moral, and that moral or that message can be applied in a number of different contexts. So the concept of consequences, the teacher said, if you get hurt, it's because you did something that you shouldn't do. So it was very interesting to see what the French immersion teachers thought about these storybooks and the ways in which they could use these storybooks to link children in the home with children in the school. We've also done a collaborative translation and translator identity research. And what we found is that in the process of translation, for those of you who've done research, it's not only the person who translates that's important in a given translation process. It's also the proofreader, it's also the editor, it's also the reader often. And so we have some data in press. In fact, this was part of the article that I shared with you for you to discuss in your class, was the fascinating ways in which people would navigate the identities, the meanings of texts that were unfamiliar to them, and how issues of translator identity were central. In fact, Asma Afreen, who also writes about translator identity, has just had a paper accepted in the TESOL Quarterly on translator identity. So that will soon be appearing in the TQ. We've also looked at Storybooks Canada and the new BC curriculum, and I've published with Michelle Gilman on this topic, because we've also realized that if you want people to take stories seriously and innovation seriously, you do have to link it to curriculum demands. Issues of the way stories travel is very interesting. This was an email I received a couple of years ago from Leslie Koyi, who is the author of Magozwe and The Day I Left Home for the City. And he was very interested to see how has his stories traveled across time and space. And so now we're working on a story, on a paper that looks at the travel, the way stories travel. So just looking here at, looking back at some of those questions. While we can talk about motivation, it's also very interesting to talk about investment and the investment that learners and students and teachers have in the language and literacy practices of a given classroom and community. And how, if there is a lack of investment, we may also perhaps have dropouts and and lack of success. And we've looked a little bit at the socio-material, how you can put a camera in a person's hand and shift their identity and the relations of power that they navigate in their community. And we've looked at the African Storybook and global storybooks as deep colonial projects, potentially where knowledge travels not from the global north to the global south, but from the global south to the global north. So what I'd like to do, since I have a little bit of time, is just to share with you what these storybooks look like, so that I hope you'll get excited about them, and possibly even do research on these storybooks, because certainly this has been done in the UK context and in many other contexts worldwide. So let me just show you here. Here we have the Storybooks Canada, and perhaps I'll just pick up one story, Counting Animals. I can pick that up. And what is very helpful here is, of course, you can very easily, you can read these stories, you can see the images as well as the text, but also you can toggle between English and French, for example, which is something that is very helpful in French immersion and in the Canadian context. But we can also change that language, and perhaps we can look at a totally very different language, Mandarin. And since this is a rather short story, maybe what I'll do is I'll just play you the audio, and let's see how much of the stories you understand.
数数动物，一头大象去喝水，两只长颈鹿去喝水。这里有3头水牛和4只鸟，全部都要去喝水。5只高脚羚和
Okay, I'm going to just stop there because I think you see the power of the audio, but I do want to share with you, so what does this actually mean? And you can, of course, toggle to English. 5 impalas and 6 warthogs are walking to the water. And of course, one can also read the same in French. So obviously, this is very powerful that you can actually toggle between different languages. And what we have here in the audio format of all these languages, which are some of the most widely spoken languages in the Canadian context: Amharic, Arabic, Bengali, Cantonese, German, Italian, Korean, Mandarin, Persian, Polish, Portuguese, Punjabi, Somali, Spanish, Swahili, Tagalog, Turkish, Ukrainian, and Urdu. But these on this drop-down menu, you have audio as well as print. But in another section of the website, you will see other languages represented where at least the print is available. And what is also exciting is the download option, right? So you can download these stories, of course, free of charge. And what I love about this download option is that, children can write their own stories. This is a wordless PDF, and they can see the image, and then they can write their own stories. Or they can read the story and also draw their own pictures. But what is perhaps one of the most powerful are the bilingual PDFs. So here, for example, you'll see the story, Counting Animals, and you'll see that it's available, in this case, in both Mandarin and English. So that download feature is a very powerful feature that can be used, in both the home context as well as in the school context. Let me go back to perhaps the home site here, and just to show you that we've got many resources on the website where we've got interviews, we've got articles that have been written, we've got research that we've done that you can certainly go down and find these all freely available. We have videos on the Global Storybooks Project, Sarah Davidson's work, Monica Shank, and others, wonderful videos, as well as a teaching guide for English language learners. So I'll take you, we do happen to have a link for teachers. And what we do here is that we align stories to the BC curriculum, which I have shared with you. But we also have this free teaching guide that can take you to look at 8 stories and ways in which you may be able to utilize these stories in your classrooms, and in fact, for research, if that's something that should be of interest to you. I'm going to just take you just briefly to have a look at the Global Storybooks project, because you can see the many countries that we now work in: Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Brazil, African context, Denmark, East Timor, Germany, Ghana. Maybe I'll just show you, let's see, let me just show you our Storybooks Jamaica. Because one interesting thing, you know, about different forms of English is that here we've got, we have Jamaican, Storybook Jamaica available in English, but also in Jamaican Creole, because Jamaican Creole is the language really most frequently used by people in the Jamaican context. So we also work, you know, with Creoles and make these freely available on our sites. I don't know if people might want to just experiment, and here perhaps I'll take you to the Indigenous Storybooks project. Here we go. And in the Indigenous Storybooks project, we do not use stories from the African context. We use stories from little Cree books here. And so we can change languages. Let's have a look at, for those people who haven't heard Old Masset, let's have a look and see if we can actually play the story over here. And it's just 1 minute long, and it might be very interesting for you to hear an Indigenous language in this context.
Tan gidi sange uijang. Tan gidi skinang. Tan gidi kil lagang. Gyang sui anga tan gidi gyandagang katsang. Tan gidi hangang glat.
Okay, I'll stop then. I'll just give you one little toggle to see what this is about. Little bear washes his face. So you can see, you know, in a sense, how powerful technology is, how we can actually draw on technology, you know, to promote language learning and teaching, and to provide this freely, to make this freely available to teachers as well as parents and caregivers in the home context. And there is, you'll see in Indigenous Storybooks, we have many different languages that are available in, you know, in the Indigenous context. So I think what I'm going to do, let me think, is I think that I'm going to leave it at that, and come back to a conversation here on questions that you might have, comments that you might have on this project, on these ideas, on any of the stories that you can connect with, and certainly some of the papers that you've read for this presentation. So perhaps I'll just say thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions that you might have. I think that there is a chat over here, and so if people want to put the questions in the chat, they're very welcome to, or certainly people can ask their questions at present. I don't know, I think you were asking, Enrica, you wanted to be reminded to turn off the recording.
I just wanted to thank you for this wonderful talk. We also have the privilege of having Dr. Norton be a critical friend in our newly published book, The Routledge Handbook of Plurilingual Language Education, where she reminded us of some of the concepts that you have heard about today. So thank you also for that.
Thank you. And in fact, I did publish co-author a paper with a colleague in Uganda, so I'm very well, congratulations on that wonderful collection as well.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, you published with that colleague. Yeah, or he did. Yeah, great. Okay, thank you for everything. And I'll switch off the recording now. Stop the recording.